we off to the races. And of course, I don't do this, and he doesn't want me doing this, but I want to do it just to piss him off. But again, special thanks to the Rocco Cozza group of people. Their official name is the Cozza Law Group. Rocco friendship and certainly the sponsorship. It means a lot to us. It's an exclusive sponsorship. It enables us to do this, so we thank you. I know it's unnecessary, but there you go. But
Thanks for keeping the lights on. There's a lot of them.
I definitely.
She's been waiting all day to say that. She's like,
I just came up with that just
That's
now.
awesome.
Can you believe it?
there is a lot of lights.
Come on.
She is on. James, we yield the floor to you, my friend. And what are we talking about today?
I call this one Holes in the Poles, and this is the controversial hollow earth theory. And so I presented this at MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, Pittsburgh, this past spring. And sometimes I look at some of these theories and initially they seem kind of outlandish, but I do kind of a deep dive and I see what evidence is actually behind it. And there's a little more to this one than you might initially think. So for any of your viewers and listeners, as soon as you see the topic, if you're like, oh, come on, this is ridiculous, just stick with it because this one ties into so many good things. We've got Nazis. We've got hollow earth. We've got Great Flood of Noah. We've got secret bases under Antarctica. This one touches on a lot of fantastic conspiracies.
Yeah, who doesn't like an enemy like a Nazi, right? That's like a super villain.
By the way, is this show 10 for this UFO
This is
crew?
11.
Is this 11?
Yeah, I'm on point this
We are
time. I
well
know for a
into
fact
double
this is
digits.
11.
Wow.
Yeah. Can you believe that?
That's
Which is really
amazing.
12 for you because you and I did a one-on-one.
And
We
it's
did.
10, it's 10 for me because I missed one.
You did.
Yeah, see? So there we go.
There you go.
Oh,
If
yeah,
you
that
missed
was the-
today,
that was
Rocco
the money
Cozza was
one,
waiting
right?
in the wings to be sitting right there.
Nope.
Had you
Oh,
missed
wow.
it.
Had I missed my flight.
Rocco's like, how do I get on that UFO thing? Going, well, we only got four chairs, man. I don't know. We probably, maybe, somehow, maybe down the line could do something.
That's a huge flex on your part, though, telling the sponsor of the show, like, oh, sorry, I don't think we get you on that one.
If you want me to take a day off, I would
No,
take one off.
no. He wouldn't.
Now she
want
got a new cat. She wants to
He-
take it.
I know. I mean, like I was
cat.
going to say, like I need extra time I can go spend with Mr. Max, who we just learned today.
But
is
the
a
funny
Max.
thing about him, though, is like, here's this. Him and I met in 19, first time he was on the podcast. We just hit it off and we developed this friendship. But here is this very pragmatic, forward-thinking business attorney, right? And I would once in a while I'd chide him with a UFO comment or something, whatever. Then the pandemic comes, and his whole view of the world like changes, and now he opens up our one-on-one conversations like, oh yeah, UFOs are here. What else is going to happen now? Like, it's like he's totally into it.
Yeah.
He's gone
that's so great.
He's gone through some he's watched all of our shows. He's gone through down some rabbit holes, and he's like, he's a believer now.
Yeah. The truth is out there.
Well, hopefully this presentation will increase Rocco's belief.
Right
So,
on.
got a pretty good one. It is heavy visuals like all of ours, but I think the awesome thing about these shows, if you're just listening in your car, if you just download it, I think the audio will still be really good. So as kind of a preamble to this with the audience when I presented, I wanted to at least show some holes in other places in the solar system, because I think the idea of a hollow earth becomes more believable if you could. Oh, is that new? That's nice.
Changes color.
It changes color. It was purple just a minute ago.
That's
Oh,
right.
that is rad.
See, I like that one a lot.
That's just for us.
Yeah, that's right.
So we do have some strange things going on at polar regions in other places. So this is NASA's Juno probe, launched in 2011, primarily exploring Jupiter. And what it found at Jupiter's polar region were perfectly geometrical polygons of cyclones. And this is interesting because aside from the level of atomic structure, polygons are just not a shape that you get naturally in nature. Prior to this, it's just been assumed if you get a polygon out there in outer space, something has artificially constructed it. And scientists are still kind of at a loss for this one, and they've suggested it even hints at the need for new physics. So that's on Jupiter. The one that blows my mind, though, one of my favorite NASA probes, this is Cassini. And so it launched in 97. It took it a number of years to get out to Saturn. It explored Saturn, and it found water geysers shooting out of Saturn's moon, Enceladus. It confirmed liquid lakes of methane and ethane on Titan. But the really awesome, unexplainable discovery, you can actually see in this NASA composite. Does anybody see the weird thing it found on Saturn? Look right up at Saturn's North Pole there. It found a huge hexagon storm. And so once again, nobody knows for sure why this is actually there. So NASA has offered a lot of ideas like, well, the winds are just really, really special on Saturn.
But
and
it looks mathematically consistent. Like
yes,
odd.
the symmetry is absolutely fantastic with it. And somewhat the irony to me, NASA is the first to explain away anything found in our own solar system. But check this out. At the same exact time, they are also supporting the search for alien megastructures. So what you all see here is an example of a Dyson swarm. So as a human civilization right now, get how humbling this is. We humans use about a millionth billionth of our sun's energy, a millionth billionth. But the idea is civilizations can get advanced enough. They could basically place satellites in a huge swarm around their star. So this one's called a Dyson swarm, but it goes even farther. Civilizations could get advanced enough. Michio Kaku talks all about this. They could create a Dyson sphere that would totally encapsulate their star, and they could get 100% of their star's energy. So it's curious to me that NASA is quick to dismiss these things as natural phenomena in our own solar system. But then at the same time, there's been a huge paradigm shift with astronomers, and they're actively looking for alien megastructures out there. Now, to me personally, this is kind of my own pet theory here. When you look at Saturn from above, and then over on the right, we have the famous gold-plated Voyager 1 and 2 phonograph records. Do you guys remember anything about these?
Yeah. I think it was... Who was
Carl Sagan. Yeah. Carl Sagan, very instrumental. So on these things, they're attached to Voyagers 1 and 2, which are now out of our solar system. They're plated in gold, so they'll never, ever corrode. And on them, you have pictures from Earth, you have greetings in many languages, you have sounds, you have 27 musical tracks. But I look at a record on the right, I look at Saturn on the left, and sometimes I just wonder to myself, could a civilization get so advanced? What if there's a little bit more to some of these planet ring systems than we think? Could there actually be any information encoded in the rings and the planets in our outer solar system out there?
Interesting.
And we finally figure it out once we reach a level to explore it closely. Now, the really wild one, though, in terms of things that potentially are hollow, let's jump a lot closer, and that is Mars. So we were talking about this a little bit pre-show. And in fairness to the amazing men and women engineers that are working for different space agencies all around the Earth, sending a probe out to another planet or moon from the Earth while both planets are in motion is an incredible task. And it is a huge mathematical achievement to do it. And so you are going to lose some of them. But this is pretty insane. A whopping 60% of Mars probes, and keep in mind, Mars is the second closest planet to us, have either failed, disappeared, or only been partially successful. You can see it's happened to the United States, Soviet Union, Russia, United Kingdom, and India as well. So some people kind of joke that there is a galactic ghoul out there that is keeping us from exploring Mars too closely. So is it really a joke? So probably the best evidence for hollow artificial objects in our solar system lies with one of Mars's two moons. This one is Phobos. So Earth and Mars are the only planets in the inner solar system that have moons. Mercury doesn't have any. Venus doesn't have any. And Mars's moons are very different than Earth's moon. They're much smaller. You can see the dimensions of Phobos right there. For those of you that just listening, it's less than 30 kilometers wide. It's irregularly shaped. So officially, these are captured asteroids. They got too close to Mars at one point. Mars sucked them in with its gravitational pull. But interestingly, as early as 1958, the Soviet scientist Joseph Shulkovsky said that the acceleration that he's seeing from Phobos, because crazy thing, eventually Phobos is going to hit into Mars, which could be a challenge for future colonists, basically would only be possible if this little moon was hollow inside. So as early as 58, the Soviets were way ahead of us in terms of scientific thinking in some areas. He suggested this thing was actually a thin sheet metal structure of artificial construction, and it was a hollowed out iron sphere. And what's really fascinating about it is the only mainstream explanation that astronomers can give right now sounds like even more of a stretch. They basically claim the only way this is possible is if Phobos is not actually a solid moon. If it's basically a rubble pile that got covered in dust so it only looks like a solid moon. which I don't even buy in the slightest, because the tidal forces from Mars would just pull this thing right apart. Now, I've got a pretty wild story to add some credibility to that. So if we just had Shokowski's account from 58, you could say, well, you know what, maybe this guy's calculations were a little bit wrong. Fred, because I know that you are the most well-versed of the bunch, do you know anything about any of the times the Russians, the Soviets have tried to explore Phobos, some of the crazy stuff that's happened?
Yes.
Do you want to give us a little bit?
Well, I don't know the names of the projects that went, but they had the one on video, and they're using the camera, and it's coming around, and they're ready to go and engage and here it comes out of the side is a long cylindrical matchstick looking thing, and here it comes, and it's coming right at you, and then nothing. It zapped it. It's gone. It blew you see the object coming towards it, but it's not an asteroid. It's not a it's not round. It's a tubular, looks like a matchstick coming at it, and then it flashes, and the probe's gone.
Your on the spot storytelling is so good. Yeah, that was absolutely perfect. So the probe in question was Phobos 2, and Fred's right. As it was nearing Phobos, something impacted it and totally destroyed the probe. And interestingly, the Soviets were very open about it. So here we have a photograph of one of their cosmonauts, test pilot Marina Popovich. She came on a speaking tour to the United States. She shows one of the last images the probe took as it approached Phobos. And if you look in the bottom there, that bright white elongated object was what ended up smashing into the probe and destroying it. Now, NASA countered it and said, there's nothing actually there. That's just an image artifact that the Soviets are misinterpreting. But where it gets really creepy, this was also one of the final photos from Phobos 2. It showed an enormous disc-shaped shadow racing across the surface of the moon before the probe ended up being destroyed. And then there's a side urban legend to this one as well. Supposedly, the Soviets never released the final photograph, and what the probe had photographed upset them so much they went directly to the Vatican about it. So we're not quite done with Phobos. There's one more story that's interesting, but I do have our first video clip. Eric, are you okay with that?
Sure.
Okay, so just to cite all of these, I've got 4 for you today. A couple are from Ancient Aliens. The first one, though, is from the Science Channel. So if you want a runner-up channel to really, really good extraterrestrial content after the History Channel, I would go Science Channel. Let's check it out.
The Red Planet has always fascinated mankind, but it is a dangerous obsession. To date, over half the missions to Mars have failed.
T-minus 20 seconds.
December 11th, 1998.
We have ignition and we have liftoff. We continue to explore the mysteries of the Red Planet.
A Delta II rocket carries NASA's $125 million Mars Climate Orbiter on the first leg of its journey to the Red Planet.
So there's a lot of anticipation that this mission is going to succeed, get an orbit around Mars, and help us understand the global properties of that planet.
On September 23rd, 9 months after its launch, the probe begins to decelerate as it enters Mars's orbit and disappears behind the Red Planet.
We expect it to be out of communication as it breaks around the far side of the planet. It's a period of nervousness, though. We will all breathe a sigh of relief when we finally hear from it.
The team expects the orbiter to be out of contact with mission control for just 1 hour. But after 90 minutes, there is still no sign of the probe. The probe is dead.
No fewer than 15 probes have been lost. They've come from NASA, Russia, China, and the UK. They've all failed. In 1989, the Russian Phobos 2 probe is taking pictures of the Martian surface when, bam, something hits it and it spirals out of control.
The Soviet Space Agency loses all contact with the probe, but not before it beams back the image from its final moments.
There's no mistaking it. The image is of a huge cylindrical object about 12 miles long.
NASA does not believe the Mars Climate Orbiter's fate is related to any previous incident. After 7 weeks of investigation, NASA reveals the cause of the probe's disappearance was human error. The probe's computer guidance system was using U.S. measurements, and the probe was built to work with the metric system.
Now, I wanted to stop it right there, and this is a great reason I show this video, because we don't want to go too far and think that every single space probe that doesn't work well is because of aliens. This one runs the full gamut. They show the craziness of Phobos too, but then Mars Climate Orbiter, that one was really embarrassing for NASA. It ended up impacting Mars because one team of NASA engineers was using US units, the other team was using the metric system, and they didn't even realize it until they had launched the probe. So as high school teachers, that one's always a great cautionary tale to share with students when they complain about why are we learning these units. So that's a pretty interesting one. So I did have one final story on Phobos before we just kind of opened it up here, because next we're going to get to the moon, and the moon is nuts. There's one other interesting thing that has been found on this moon. So in 2009, NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter captured this protruding up from the surface, and it became dubbed the Phobos monolith. So I know you guys will know, being film buffs, what iconic Stanley Kubrick movie does that remind you?
2001.
Yeah, absolutely. And so skeptically, you could say, well, you know, it's just a big rectangular rock. But none other than second man on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, said a lot more about it. And I actually found the original interview from C-SPAN. This is Buzz's actual quote. There's a monolith there, a very unusual structure on this little potato-shaped object that goes around Mars once every 7 hours. When people find out about that, they're going to say, who put that there? Who put it there? Well, the universe put it there, or if you choose, God put it there. So this was kind of just my little preamble. We already have some interesting things happening at the poles of Jupiter and Saturn that nobody can explain. And we do seem to have a lot of evidence that something highly unusual is going on at Phobos, and it might be partly hollow inside. So before we jump to the moon, does anybody have anything so far?
Like, they estimate how tall that thing is? I mean, you can see the shadow, obviously.
Oh, that's a great question. Given the scale here, it was a couple meters tall. So it's not like, I remember one time on the show, we talked about structures on the moon, and some of the things photographed on the far side are an order of kilometers high. Right. This one would be many meters high, but it would be less than 100 meters high.
The metric system.
What a scam that was. That and the Dewey Decimal System. What a joke those were.
So, Julia, anything else for the cause before we go into the moon?
Nope.
All right.
I don't get that. Like, how did that get there? That's definitely not just... Nature's just not going to make that.
That's basically what Buzz said. And, you know, if we just had this, if this was the only anomalous thing with Phobos, you could say, you know what, it just happens to be a very large rectangular rock. But then when you add in everything else, even a couple years ago, the Russians actually tried to land another probe on Phobos. It was called the Phobos Grunt mission. And once again, they got really close and totally malfunctioned. And I had actually read a story one time. Fred, you're familiar with remote viewing, right?
Yes.
So they actually had some remote viewers, I know we've talked about on the show, try to remote view what happened to Phobos 2. And the impression that this group all had gotten was the probe had gotten too close to Phobos, and it basically had activated a defensive system that a more advanced civilization had on Phobos, and it just reflexively shot out something at the probe and it eliminated it, which, you know, it depends how much you believe in remote viewing, how valid you find it, but a whole team of US trained remote viewers got that distinct impression. So, all right. So like a lawyer trying to build my case here. So let's jump a little bit closer to Earth. When you want to talk about hollow objects or near hollow objects in the solar system, probably your number one candidate is right next door to us, and that's the moon. So real quick backstory. Even today, despite the moon being the closest object in the solar system to us, there is a huge debate on how the moon actually formed. Here are the four leading hypotheses. One is called fission. Basically, the moon spun off from the Earth. One is called condensation. The moon and Earth just happened to form right beside each other from the gas cloud of our solar system, and then the moon went into orbit. One is capture. So like Mars's moons, basically the moon came from elsewhere, Earth pulled it in. And then one, as you're seeing in this artist depiction, is large impact. So something big smashed into the Earth billions of years ago when it was mostly still molten, and that formed the moon. So right now, I would say most astronomers would say it's a combination of capture and large impact. So early in the solar system's history, where there were still a lot of big pieces floating out there, the young Earth pulled in something, smashes into the Earth. Some people think that's what formed the mighty Pacific Ocean basin. Piece breaks off, and that's the moon. But every single one of these has major shortcomings today. So there is a fifth hypothesis, which surprisingly answers all of these questions, but it's very controversial, and that is the hollow moon. So a lot of people are like, all right, well, now we're going to put on the tinfoil hats here. But there are a number of very well-respected scientists throughout history who have advocated for hollow Earth and hollow moon. So Edmund Halley, British physicist and astronomer famous for Halley's Comet, in 1692 first suggests a hollow Earth. British novelist H.G. Wells, in his epic First Men on the Moon, which ended up inspiring Wernher von Braun and a lot of the early people that worked at NASA, first suggested a hollow moon. And then by 1970, you might remember I said the Soviets in some ways were so far ahead of us. Scientists Michael Vassin and Alexander Shcherbakov in the prestigious Soviet Academy of Sciences published Is the Moon the Creation of Artificial Intelligence? And they felt like this was the one hypothesis that really answered all of these contradictions. So what evidence do we actually have? We have a surprisingly strong amount of evidence that at least large portions of the moon are hollow inside. So this is Apollo 12. And this is one of my favorite Apollo missions. And sadly, this one gets kind of buried because if you think about it, on one side, you've got Apollo 11, Neil and Buzz, the first man landing, first most famous mission in history. Then on the other side, you've got the drama of Apollo 13. Apollo 12 is right in between. And unlike Neil and Buzz and Michael Collin, these three men really got along well. They were best friends. They had matching gold Corvettes, and they had a near flawless mission. So during this mission, NASA wanted to try a little bit of additional science. On Apollo 11, Neil and Buzz had deployed seismic sensors on the lunar surface. So after Conrad and Bean re-rendezvoused with Dick Gordon, who's piloting the command module, never walks on the moon, just orbits the moon. So they re-rendezvous, all three men get back into the command module. They seal the airlock, and NASA has them deorbit and crash the lunar module into the moon's surface. So they were hoping if they got really, really lucky, the moon might vibrate just for a little bit. The LEM impacts 40 miles from the Apollo 11 site, and the moon rings like a bell. It peaks in 8 minutes, and it takes it over an hour to dissipate. Now, Apollo 13 does one better. Despite the explosion on board, most people know from watching the Tom Hanks movie, they never get to land. NASA still had them do a little bit of science. So the men deorbited the spent stage of their S-4B booster. So just a real quick review of the Apollo missions. This is a multi-stage design. They're heading to the moon. The S-4B booster has already fired to get them to escape velocity. But because of momentum, it's still following along with them. So the astronauts had remote control of it. They deorbit the thing and they smash it into the moon. It was about 11 times more massive than the LEM. And so it hits 85 miles from the Apollo 12 site. This time NASA was shocked. The moon rang like a gong. The shock wave peaked in 7 minutes, but it took a full 3 hours to dissipate. Wow. And the only way this is possible is if there are huge hollow areas inside the moon. So for those of you listening, this one is not necessarily a conspiracy. As recent as 2013, this was an awesome mission. NASA launched the Grail. And I think the name itself is pretty curious. The Grail, like the Holy Grail. These were 2 twin space probes, and it was fascinating what they did. They would orbit around the moon together, and the distance between the 2 probes was very, very precisely monitored. So as gravitational anomalies inside the moon changed, the distance between the 2 probes changed. And that's how they actually map the interior of the moon. And so not everything has ever been released on the Grail mission. So to wrap up the moon, we not only have big hollow areas, we also have the opposite. We have huge disc-shaped areas buried under the surface. And I'm pretty sure we touched on these in one previous episode. So these are the mascons, and it's short for mass concentration. Fred, do you recall anything, because I know you're really into moon stuff like me, on the mascons at all?
That basically everything's the same depth, correct? It's so you would have an asteroid or something crashing into the moon, you'd expect to make a hole. Well, it doesn't. It crashes and it levels out at a certain level. All these craters are the same depth.
Fred's right. Not only are all the major craters the same depth, but curiously, the bottom bowls of the craters are actually convex and not concave. So on every other solid body in the solar system, they're concave. Here, they actually bubble up on the bottom. Like at some depth, they're hitting some impenetrable surface. So these red areas are the really big concentrations. And NASA found these quite by accident in preparation for the lunar landings. They found that the gravitational pull of these things distorted the orbits of their probes. And so these are large disc-shaped masses. And you can see a side-by-side. It's almost like a bullseye, like an X marks the spot at the center of the large mare. So astronomers mostly believe that these things are sunken underground lava chambers. But hollow moon theorists say, no, these aren't at the right depths for lava chambers. These are actually the remnants of whatever advanced technology was there that basically hollowed large portions of the moon out.
That's crazy.
So getting closer to Earth, we do have a lot of evidence, and this isn't even the realm of conspiracy. It is established, but nobody really has a good explanation. On our next door neighbor, we have big hollowed out areas on it.
But wasn't there like some big conspiracy theory that like it was just kind of like a satellite place for aliens to like watch us from?
Oh, heck yes.
Isn't that like what the hollow part is that basically it's like a little like place for people to, well, people or
That's
other
no
beings.
moon. It's a space station.
That's yeah, exactly. Like that. It's kind of like, there's just like a little place in there to hang out and, kind of keep an eye on us.
Well, you're exactly right. And we may have touched on that in a previous episode, but what's fascinating is if you look at some of the oldest cultures on Earth, like even the Australian Aborigines, officially the moon has been here for billions of years, but they have passed down through their oral traditions that their ancestors were actually here before the moon appeared in the sky. And then if you look half a world away at the writings of Plato traveled a lot to Egypt. He got a lot of their mythology. And Plato referred to a group called the Proselene. So Selene, Latin for moon, Proselene, before the moon, a group of people that was actually here before that. So one of the more controversial theories, to your point, Julia, is this object really was brought in from outside the solar system. And some people believe it was relatively recent history. Some people even tried to equate the Great Flood of Noah with the arrival of the moon in our orbit.
But would that mean that like it basically disrupted the ocean so much that it kind of like...
Yes,
okay.
That is exactly what it would mean. And it is an anomaly. I mean, we are now up to close to 200 moons in our solar system. Our moon is the 5th biggest, and the only 4 that are bigger orbit Jupiter and Saturn, which are exponentially larger than the Earth. So even mainstream astronomers and physicists are still debating how could a moon so relatively large stay in such a balanced orbit around the Earth.
Mm-hmm. And have they actually like debated whether it's because of like density comparison or something? Anything like I mean, like I understand like or size-wise that like, but is there any actual explanation as to why that would make sense?
Oh, well, I can give you both sides of that. So some people believe when the Apollo astronauts brought back rocks from the lunar surface, it basically confirmed that the moon had come from the Earth because a lot of what they call the isotopic ratios were the same. Curiously, though, the Apollo astronauts also brought back rocks that had highly industrialized metals in them that do not occur naturally on the surface of the Earth, like chromium, things that are not natural. So the counter argument is if the moon is really coming out from the Earth, a piece of the Earth, it should basically have all of the same minerals that at least our crust and mantle have. and it doesn't. The other odd thing about the moon, and so far this is true only for the moon and Phobos, every other object in the solar system, whether it's the Earth, whether it's the sun, gets progressively denser as you go towards the center, towards the core. The moon is the opposite. Its shell is actually the densest, and it gets less dense as you go in. In fact, the shell is so dense, the crust is so dense that the Apollo astronauts really struggled to drill down into it. And even on Apollo 11, they were really worried because they had to plant the flag. Richard Nixon calls from the Oval Office. And some people there are like, how did he make that call when my cell phone only gets like 2 bars today and I can't call the next town? But Neil and Buzz were worried that they hadn't drilled enough into the lunar surface, and they stood up the flag. They were worried it was just going to like fall right over while Nixon was talking to them. So it's to
that would have been great.
So to your point, there are some things that do show evidence that the moon came from Earth, but then there are other pieces of evidence that show that this thing came from a totally different place.
And then a sidebar, just I'm talking about drilling. Like, did you hear about that thing recently that they just stopped? Like whoever had dug the deepest hole, like.
I have that in this presentation.
Oh, excellent.
It's coming, and
okay,
it is spectacular.
Great. Okay.
One quick question for you. It's connected. So this is what I don't understand. You know, astronomers make the assumption that all of the known elements that we have are found throughout the universe. And what we have, that's all there is. That's the assumption they go under. Case in point, they created that disk in gold because the assumption is that gold's that one element that is indestructible, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But isn't that naive to a degree that there could not be other elements or other substances out there in this cataclysm of space that we just don't know of? Are there scientists that believe that, or is the conventional wisdom that what we have here is the same that is throughout the entire universe?
No, that's a great question. I can answer that in 3 parts. So almost the entire universe is just hydrogen and helium, and that is it. Everything else, literally everything else, is lumped into metals. And metals just means everything from lithium, atomic number 3, the whole way on. So us being here, this desk, everything physical here, all of what you see is a spectacular anomaly in the universe on the whole, because almost everything is hydrogen and helium. Now, to your more direct point, yes, everything seems to be made of mostly the same things, but they continue to discover new elements to add onto the periodic table. Like, for example, when Bob Lazar first came out.
Pentenium or something?
Unpentium. When he first came out back in 1989 and said, these crafts are powered by element 115. The periodic table at the time maybe only went up to uranium is the last naturally occurring element, and maybe they had just gotten into the early 100s. All the rest of the stuff they can only create in laboratory settings for like split seconds. And so at the time, everybody's like, this guy's totally nuts. The periodic table doesn't go that high. Well, sure enough, here we are. We have 115. It's unpentium. Now, the only other thing that I can share, and this gets into the alien stuff, my hypothesis is probably extraterrestrials have access to the same elements that we do. But what people consistently find, those whistleblowers who have come out and have worked with this alien technology, they say under a microscope, under a scanning electron microscope, they say it is like nothing we have ever seen. They'll say they will basically take the element aluminum, which we have a known atomic structure, but they say when they look at it from an alien craft under a scanning electron microscope, they say all the atoms are lined up in perfect rows. And when this happens, it gives these elements different properties that we just don't naturally get on the Earth. So my guess would be they are working with the same raw materials we are, but they have such an advanced level of engineering, they can do things with them that we can't even touch.
But if we're just finding, we're still in the process of finding naturally occurring elements, right? Slowly, we're finding them.
I
don't
know.
Say there isn't 3,000 of them? We just haven't been here long enough to discover them all.
I could be wrong. Chemistry is not my total wheelhouse. I am pretty sure uranium is the last naturally occurring element. Periodic table right now goes up into the high teens, low 120s. I think everything else has just been made in a laboratory setting so far. But you're not wrong. They definitely could find this stuff out there. Like, perfect example is diamonds, super rare on the Earth. Years ago, astronomers found evidence for a white dwarf, a burned out core of a star that had crystallized. White dwarfs are carbon. So if it crystallized, somewhere out there, there is literally a single diamond floating around that is like thousands of miles wide. So, you know, diamonds are so difficult to make here. We can make them synthetically now. On other planets, they could just be as common as gravel are here. So it's not out of the realm of possibility.
Okay.
I'm kind of pausing. This is normally where somebody would need a bathroom break. No bathroom breaks? We're just plowing right in this?
I'm good.
Wow. Okay. All right. That's very exciting. Let me just
It's
make
that
sure.
medicine Flonase.
I
Okay.
had two breaks before we started.
All right. We are
so-
still recording. I just want to make sure because I know a couple times I've let you down audio-wise.
We're good.
All right. So anytime we can incorporate the dastardly Nazis into a conspiracy, everybody is still
Everybody likes a
fascinated
good
to this
Nazi
day.
once in a
They
while,
really
right?
do.
Yeah.
So what you see here is Wewelsburg Castle. And if you really wanted to pick the center of Nazi occult conspiracies, it would probably be this base for the Nazi
And
SS
Stalag
right
13.
here. What's that?
And Stalag 13.
What's that?
Hogan's Heroes.
Oh, sorry. It predates me a little bit. I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
Sorry.
Stalag 13.
I was lost too.
Good.
Commander Klink.
So this is in Buren, Germany, and it was basically a castle in disrepair that Heinrich Himmler had basically taken and fashioned not only into the home of the SS, but he really wanted to try to recreate the Teutonic Knights of King Arthur lore. And so inside there is a black sun, a strong Nazi occult symbol, interlaid in the marble floor. There are 12 rays coming out from the sun and 12 columns in this room, referring to the 12 generals of the SS. And one of the conspiracies is the Germans had actually gotten a UFO crash at least 11 years before we did. So there's the famous Black Forest UFO
Before
crash.
Roswell.
Before Roswell. Some people allege that was brought here, and so the Nazis actually got a big jump on us in anti-gravity technology. So just a little bit about a couple of these secret societies. So first up, we have the Ahnenerbe Society, which in German meant ancestral heritage. This one was overseen by Himmler, and it was tasked with uncovering the lineage of the German people. This was the group that was in search at the polar regions of the fabled Aryan race, the perfect race from which the Nazis had supposedly descended. Then probably the most infamous and spooky of the Nazi secret societies were the Vril. So like the Black Sun, this is probably a proxy of their bigger Thule society. And so this one focused on the esoteric aspects of the occult, mediums, and channeling. I can say from everything that I've read on the Nazis, it doesn't seem like they were really into the demonic aspects of the occult as much as they were trying through mediums and channeling to gain a strategic technological advantage on the Allies. And so these are where we have the iconic long-haired German mediums like Maria Orsich. And these were supposedly the channelers. Now, if you read on...
She has short hair.
She does. She was the exception to the rule. Most of them actually had long hair because the Germans believed that the long hair essentially acted like an antenna.
Me and Fred are over here like comparing hair.
Fred, you're such a
like,
hussy.
Like,
Fred, are you getting any messages right now?
I am.
Yeah. So they thought that this made these women better receivers. Now understand, this is still a couple decades before the concept of remote viewing comes out big in the United States and the Soviet Union. But if you read about what these women were trying to do, it sounds very similar to remote viewing today. So with the Vril, and we'll come back then, we have the larger Thule Society. So this is where we really get the Nazi fascination with the polar regions. So they had the views of the Ahnenerbe, looking for the Aryan race. But then the Thule also incorporated legends like Atlantis, the Hollow Earth. They were searching for religious artifacts. So let's take the Vril and see how that actually applied to anti-gravity. On the left, we had the head of these Nazi secret programs, Hans Kammler, one of many Nazi elite who completely disappeared after World War II. They never know what actually happened to him. So the Germans are scouring the earth for these different artifacts. That's where we get a lot of the inspiration from Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail, the Last Crusade, all of that, the Ark of the Covenant, that comes from the Germans. And so supposedly Orsich and the other mediums were able to contact an alien civilization from the Aldebaran star system, and they received communications. And so Vril does have a more sinister connotation with the Germans and with today's conspiracies. But at the time, the Nazis were basically using this word to mean the energy that pervaded all of space and time. So they believed that the universe was filled with energy, even in the vacuum of outer space. And it sounds very similar to what physicists look at today for zero-point energy. So the Germans thought they could capture this energy, and that could lead them to exotic propulsion. So just a quick side note on Aldebaran. If you're ever a fan of stargazing during the wintertime, you've definitely seen it. You just take the 3 belt stars of Orion the Hunter, follow the line up, 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 and you come to this V shape at the face of Taurus the Bull. And Aldebaran is the reddish star right at the eye of Taurus. And it's a very interesting star. It's a red giant, so it's like our sun, but it's millions and millions of years older. So in theory, if there was a civilization that developed there, they could be well ahead of us. It's only 65 light years away, making it one of the closer stars. And interestingly, astronomers have studied this. I always found this creepy. They're not sure whether Aldebaran is actually part of our corner of the Milky Way or if it's just a nomadic star passing through. So we think a lot about spaceships and UFOs, but I think, could a civilization get advanced enough that they could actually place their entire star into motion and basically explore one corner of a galaxy as their planet slings along? So they supposedly encountered a civilization from Aldebaran. And this sounds like an urban legend, but we actually have an account of one man that worked early on at NASA with Dr. Werner von Braun himself. And he related a story where he and von Braun were looking through a file cabinet of some very classified documents. And so von Braun is flipping through these manila folders, and the man at NASA could just see the labels on the top of the manila folders. And a couple of them happened to be about UFOs. And he didn't want to dare ask to see them, but at the time he basically asked von Braun, he said, Werner, he said, back during World War II, because at this point von Braun is a U.S. citizen, he said, how did you guys make such progress so rapidly? And he said von Braun never even stopped paging through the files, but he just nodded at the manila folders on UFOs and just said them and just kept going. And I always found that account very, very interesting. So how are we going to tie this all into the Hollow Earth? As World War II draws to a close, upwards of 250,000 Nazis totally go missing. And that includes some high-ranking ones like Hans Kammler. There is even a lot of debate about Adolf Hitler himself. Does anybody, Fred, you might know, does anybody want to add kind of the conspiracy about whether or not Adolf Hitler is actually dead or not?
Down in Brazil?
I'll take this.
Portugal?
Argentina. I'll take this.
Alabama?
So, yeah, supposedly, Der Fuhrer, it's not him that they found burned outside his bunker. He didn't commit suicide, and supposedly he committed suicide and shot himself. And
about his woman?
I was about to say, wasn't it him and his wife?
Yeah,
or woman?
yeah.
What happened to her? Yeah.
Well, she
for sure.
She took the cyanide, and then that's what they say. They took him outside, and as the Russians are approaching, he was afraid that they were going to mutilate his body if they caught him.
What?
Oh, yeah. Because
that's weird.
That's what you do in war. And
you don't say.
So they supposedly got some gas cans, kerosene or whatever, and they doused his body and they burned him. Well, the Russians come across the bunker, and there are 2 bodies, which they say are, this is Hitler and Eva Braun.
So no one from outside of Nazi Germany ever officially saw those bodies?
Yeah,
Is that,
they were charred.
That was why
But
I heard
here's
that
where
was...
it gets fun.
Wait, I'm confused. Wait. Didn't the Americans verify?
Nope. So Fred's right. Here's what we got. This is allegedly one of the pictures of Hitler's body before, as Fred said, the Nazis themselves doused them in kerosene. Some people believe this was actually Hitler's body double. Even Politicians have them today. Like there's been some photographs of Hillary Clinton where people are like, that's not Hillary Clinton. They have body doubles today. But some people believe that was actually his body double, Gustav Veller. Now, you might be thinking, well, come on, like they tested the body. They've got all this DNA evidence. They don't. Here's what happened. Soviets get there. As Fred said, the bodies have been burned. So there's no direct, and they didn't have DNA sampling time. The Soviets take the remains, they burn them again, and then they bury them in Berlin. Now, if you remember, post-World War II, Berlin is divided into East and West. When the Soviet Union started to fall and the wall was coming down, the Soviets were worried that Hitler's grave would basically become like a pilgrimage point for neo-Nazis. They dig the body back up again, they burn it again, and they throw the remains into the River Elbe. So all that officially remains of Hitler, you can see over there at the right, is a skull fragment. But a couple years ago, a team of scientists got permission to actually do DNA sampling of the skull fragment. And they found that it was just the DNA of a much younger woman. And so they have no direct proof that Hitler actually died in that bunker. And so over the years, a number of different tabloids have come out and photographs supposedly showing Hitler, usually through South America. Now, what we do know for sure is a number of Nazis definitely escaped to South America. Even to this day, throughout Argentina and Brazil, there are a number of towns with German names. But this came up again fairly recently. When President Trump was in office, he initially wanted to declassify all of the JFK assassination files, which people were really hoping he would do. So he walked that back, but he declassified thousands of them. And on one of them, indirectly, they found something about Adolf Hitler. So this was actually addressed to J. Edgar Hoover. Post-World War II, the FBI was following leads that Hitler was in Argentina. So it doesn't necessarily prove that the United States knew Hitler was alive, but it does show that they at least doubted the accounts of the Soviet Union enough that they were still pursuing these leads. So, did the Nazis flee anywhere else other than just Argentina? And this really starts to get us into Hollow Earth, which I hope you guys are liking the build-up so far.
Yeah, so that was... Is this where Bird has that?
Yes.
Okay.
I got a whole sidebar there. It's definitely coming. So the Soviets had great interest in Antarctica even prior to World War II. They called this Neuschwabenland basically their new motherland. And it was always nebulous about territory claims down here. So a few times the Germans flew over parts of Antarctica and dropped thousands of little tiny flags with swastikas saying that they claimed it. And so the urban legend is a large amount of the Nazis fled to Antarctica with their very best anti-gravity disc technology right at the tail end of World War II. And so there have always been stories that the United States intercepted a number of German U-boats on the way down. One fascinating part of history that is confirmed is people just sort of assume by reading history books when one country surrenders, every soldier in the country, every sailor just like throws down their arms. They're like, we're done.
They didn't know about it, right?
Well, yeah. And if you've ever read up on the Black Fleet or the Wolf Packs, these were basically 40 Nazi U-boat captains that even after they found out Germany had surrendered, they said, the heck with that. We are fighting on. So these U-boat attacks continued well after the Germans had surrendered. And a number of the U-boats have simply never been found. And so the story is some of these U-boats were basically filled with red mercury. And so years ago, I did an anti-gravity presentation at MUFON, Philadelphia. And so I researched a little bit about red mercury. Eric, do you recall, did we ever talk about this on the show?
No, but isn't there a very famous comic book that is derived from Nazis being in the Antarctica? And the guy comes from that? I'm not a comic book guy, but like, isn't there a famous like Marvel?
We can do one now.
I don't know about a comic book. I'm familiar with this,
like a Red
story,
Skull or
but
something, or oh man,
it does sound kind of familiar.
There was a live action movie about a decade and a half ago. And there was a couple sequels, and I'm trying to think the guy who played.
What about Hellboy?
Hellboy.
You remember in Hellboy?
Hellboy. That's exactly what I'm talking
Yeah.
about. Didn't it originate like he was found in the Nazi Antarctic?
I think you're right. Hellboy's the one with that terrifying, like, Nazi, like, robot general in it. Yeah. That's pretty wild.
Was his name Mercury? Red Mercury or something like that?
I have so many friends so into comic books, and they would be able to nail that one right away. I'm so sorry.
Hellboy, yeah.
So Red Mercury is very much a legend itself. For starters, nobody knows why it was actually called red. Some people think it was simply because they were making it in the Soviet Union. Other people allege that the mercury itself was actually red. And supposedly, when you rotated it rapidly, it had anti-gravity properties. Now, today, you can watch videos on YouTube. People will take regular mercury and they'll try to spin it around in a centrifuge to get a mass reduction. They don't get very much. But interestingly, a scientist named Samuel T. Cohen, he was the father of the neutron bomb. And there has never been a single neutron bomb used on a civilization in history, which is good because they are terrifying. He said red mercury was definitely real. He said they took mercury and they would mix it with radioactive waste to get red mercury. And so a little bit on the legend of mercury. It's not naturally occurring. You have to extract it from an ore that's called cinnabar. And so they have found it for a number of different cultures. So we dub it quicksilver today. It used to be in old school thermometers. So in the tomb of Emperor...
So it is in thermometers then?
Well, it used to be, and it's highly poisonous. But what would happen before...
It's poisonous to the human skin, right?
Yes. And
so what is regular mercury just in thermometers now? Is that what's in...
No, they use something else, and I forget what it is, but it's not mercury because it's very poisonous. My first teaching job, I worked with a guy, this is crazy. He was old enough where when people were kids in the 50s, 60s, they would break apart glass thermometers. They would play with it. Well, the guy got mercury poisoning, and it totally changed his color. His hair was bright white. His skin was permanently just dark orange, and his lips were all purple. He looked kind of like a Ken doll, just permanently. So they stopped using it in thermometers because it's super duper poisonous.
This guy you met?
Yeah. I taught with him for a year. Yeah, it was
sounds
crazy.
Like he was an alien.
Yeah, it sounds like that. So in the tomb of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, this is where we have the legendary terracotta army. So the tomb is still unopened as of 2023, but they estimate based on the soil samples, there is approximately 100 tons of liquid mercury in the tomb, representing the 100 rivers of China. Then in the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent in Mexico, they may have actually had a big lake of it underneath the tomb to symbolize the underworld. And so this could lead to the first discovery of a royal tomb at Teotihuacan. So I only put these out there to show examples that cultures throughout human history have not only been able to extract mercury, but they've been very fascinated by it. It's one of only 2 elements on the periodic table that's liquid at room temperature. And so what we do have, and these are not necessarily conspiracies, we at least have blueprints from the Nazis on these anti-gravity discs. These are called the Hanabus. Now, skeptics would say, well, that's as far as they got, was only the blueprint stage. But believers would say, no, they got much farther. So we at least have 4 different designs, and you can see how similarly they represent UFOs today. And isn't it fascinating? Von Braun and the other Nazi scientists through Operation Paperclip are taken to White Sands Missile Range in Fort Bliss, Texas in 1947. In 1943. So then only 4 years later, we have the Roswell crash out in New Mexico in that same area. So one of the neat conspiracies of Roswell, it wasn't actually aliens. This was our own experimental anti-gravity craft. And then this is kind of a funny story. The model maker Revell, I actually have one of these models at the planetarium, and the guy I bought it off, it's so awesome. He actually fashioned magnets with it where it has a big electromagnet. It'll actually hover and rotate, the one I have. But Revell actually got under a lot of political pressure, and they stopped producing this model. You can still buy it on eBay, but it's a lot more expensive because people allege that this was giving the Germans too much credit for things that they were not actually proven to make. Also, though, another blueprint that has surfaced, this was the legendary Andromeda craft. And to give you an idea of scale, look how small the Hanabus are compared to the overall blueprint, the layout of the Andromeda craft. Some people think this is basically the origin of our cigar-shaped UFOs. This would have been an aircraft carrier in the sky. And what's fascinating, you can just see one of these at the top center of this photograph. But by 1946, after World War II is over, all along the Scandinavian peninsula, Norway, Sweden, Finland, they are reporting these ghost rockets, which they claim were these long cigar-shaped ships moving faster in the sky than any World War II era airplanes could actually go. So here's one of the awesome twists on ghost rockets. And I just read this. I finished a year or two ago. I finished a book called Dark Fleet by Len Kasten. Fred, you might remember this guy also wrote Secret Journey to Planet Serpo. This guy is a man. So he threw this out there. And initially I thought that's ridiculous. But then I thought more on it. I thought that might be kind of brilliant. So Kasten alleges that the Germans were not constructing these things from scratch. They basically made UFOs out of their existing U-boats. Now, initially you hear that, you're like, come on, that's insane. But think about this. To have a spaceship, what do you need? You have to have something that's totally sealed off from the outside environment. You have to have your own internal life support. All the crew on board has to have oxygen. They have to have water. The U-boats already had all of those things. And so to me, it would make sense. Why are you going to start a spaceship from scratch? You basically have a terrestrial spaceship right here. And the legend is they modified it with an anti-gravity engine. We also have, and then we're leading into Bird, and then that'd be the perfect break point. The Bell. Fred, I know this is your jam. What do you got on Die Glock?
This is my jam. I was actually talking about this the other day. It was a time machine. They tried to make a time machine, and you can actually see around the bottom. There's the hieroglyphic, the symbols, and look, it's up there too on the other side because you knew what I was getting to. It's very, very similar in description as to what they found in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, in 1965, and suddenly as the war was coming to an end, they had Die Glock tied up in a place, like a henge. Yeah, a henge. Yeah. I couldn't think of but that's the exact what it was, and it disappeared, along with the scientists. A lot of scientists just disappeared from there, but and in 1965, something comes screeching across the sky, just above our beloved home of Pittsburgh, and it suddenly changes course. It makes a right turn or a left turn or whatever which way it was going, which that really doesn't happen with like an asteroid or something like that, or a comet or a meteorite, and it crashes 35 miles away from Pittsburgh in a little rural thicket of Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, and the first people on the scene, they see this, what they think is an acorn. It's acorn shaped. It looks like a bell. And how they describe it is having those hieroglyphics on it as well. And the Army comes and they come and check it out, and they throw it under a tarp, and nobody saw anything. You didn't see anything, and they take it out. But if you go to Kecksburg, they've got a little model of it by their fire department, the Kecksburg thing. But it was supposedly very, very similar in description to Die Glock, which was a spaceship or a time machine similar to what Vimanas. It's in India.
The Vimanas, yeah.
Mm-hmm. If you look at it, it's similar to the shape of it. Which back then in the Indian text, these things could fly, and they were spacecraft. And there's a good chance that this Kecksburg thing was Die Glock, and it traversed time, probably space, and it came screeching back to Earth in beautiful downtown Kecksburg.
Well, but our government's the one that went in and retrieved it. Yeah, right? So we don't actually know what was in there when it landed.
Well, yeah, and the people who were on the scene first, the people from the town, the volunteer fire department, they said it was relatively small. It could only fit about one full-size man in it. They couldn't find seams on it or a door or anything like that. And the Air Force admitted they did send somebody to Kecksburg that night to check it out, but they said they only sent 2 Air Force information officers. They didn't find anything. They left. But as Fred said, a lot of people from the town say, no, there's a big flatbed truck that left here with an acorn-shaped object under a tarp.
I've actually seen... I didn't see them firsthand, but I saw reproductions of photos that show where it came screeching through, and it knocked the trees down. So you have this line of broken trees, and they're like, it never happened.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, so you got the tree evidence.
Yeah, it was. But if you I saw a whole special on it, and it just intrigued me because it was close to here. You know what I mean?
It's Pennsylvania's Roswell.
Yeah, Pennsylvania's Roswell. And but yeah, so it bore striking, similarities to Die Glock.
Nice. So that, I hope we've built a big case. Eric, you had mentioned him earlier. That'll take us into the curious life of Richard Byrd, and some people believe the first to actually fly into the hollow earth itself.
Hey, I got you going now.
Apparently, bird's the word.
Bird's the word. Here it goes.
Oh, yeah. We're in.
So hollow earth really levels up when we get to this man, Richard Byrd. So he was an accomplished naval aviator. He was an officer. He first attempted the first flight over the North Pole in 1926 with a co-pilot named Floyd Bennett. He also makes, it's pretty interesting, he makes his first transatlantic flight in 1927. Charles Lindbergh beats him by only 1 month. So this man was a very, very capable aviator. So he ends up making 5 different expeditions to the polar regions. We are going to focus on 2 of them, but I'm actually reading his autobiography right now. It's simply called Alone. And this was kind of terrifying. Alone, I believe, was with his second Antarctic expedition. And as the name implies, this man literally set off across Antarctica to try to reach the South Pole all by himself.
Wow.
And so he had, this is where it gets really crazy. He had radio communication with a base that was dozens of miles back behind him. And at one point, he didn't realize this. He actually had a propane leak inside of his camp. And he was using a little heater to try to keep him warm and survive. And the men back at the base behind him realized something was up because during their radio communications, he started to just sound irrational and wasn't making any sense. Oh. And so he was getting asphyxiated from it. And so they basically set off across Antarctica to try to rescue him before he died. Wow. And they actually did. But this man is hardcore. So the 2 that we're going to focus on are his first flight over the North Pole and then the legendary Operation High Jump, which is going to tie together Hollow Earth, Nazis, UFOs, and the works. So what I did for my presentation on MUFON, I wanted to do this because people today less and less know a lot about geography. Mm-hmm. I did want to just take a minute just to try to lay out for your listeners or viewers how the North Pole and South Pole are very, very different from each other. So the North Pole is the Arctic region. The South Pole is the Antarctic region. And these areas couldn't be more different. So the North Pole, the Arctic region, this actually comes from the Greek arcos, meaning bear, because up here you could see Ursa Major, the great bear on the sky, all year long. So surprises people, there's no actual land mass at the North Pole. It's just a big ice pack that grows and shrinks with the seasons, which we'll come back to. Now the South Pole is Antarctica. And here's what is totally insane to me. When you hear about explorers going across it, hopefully after hearing this, you have an even greater respect for them. This landmass is not only enormous, it averages over 16,000 feet high. Now, to put that in perspective, I looked this up. This entire continent would be the 7th tallest mountain in the United States, and it's a whole continent. So, you talk about people like vacationing to Colorado, even if they get above 10,000 feet, a lot of people can't make it up there because of the thin air. So when you think about these men that have actually reached the South Pole, they are crossing an entire continent on foot or with dog sled. A lot of times sub-zero temperatures, thin air, 16,000 feet high. And the South Pole, this is insane, at the nearest coastline of Antarctica, the nearest one, the South Pole is still 764 miles away. Heck, I got tired driving here today from Altoona to Pittsburgh in my car. So to cover 764 miles, totally insane. So let's talk about Byrd's North Pole expedition in 1926. Byrd and Bennett make the official flight over the North Pole. Although, as this happens a lot with discoveries, it's debated. So when they looked at Byrd's journal, sneaky, he erased sextant positions of the sun, and then he rewrote different positions. And basically what it meant was, as he was getting to the North Pole, the sun should have been at a certain elevation, and it wasn't. And so then his corrected numbers show the correct elevation. And so some people think he may have actually been about 80 miles short of there, and then it officially got crossed a couple days later by a Norwegian airship. But it's only been debated. Byrd officially has the title. Now, here's where things get pretty wild. Unofficially, Byrd and Bennett are the first to see the hole in the North Pole. And for that, I'll turn it over to my man, Fred. Fred, your storytelling is awesome. What do you recall about Richard Byrd's supposed flight up to the North Pole?
Up to the North Pole? Mm-hmm. I don't remember the North Pole.
Oh, then I'll come back to you on high jump. Because high jump gets insane.
I know high jump.
Okay, so as Byrd and Bennett are getting close, they're surprised because the desolate, stark, white, icy blue landscape starts to give way to actual green vegetation. Lakes appear. And in fact, from their airplane, which wasn't very high, not only could they see life, but interestingly, Byrd claimed it actually looked like prehistoric animals. They then found a massive opening, they claimed, to inside the earth and got pulled into it. Now, there's two different versions of this, and I'm going to share them all with you. I really tried to do my research for this one. So version number one, something like a tractor beam suspends their monoplane in midair. While the monoplane is suspended in midair, an advanced civilization, curiously, not extraterrestrials, but they identified themselves as the original inhabitants of this earth. Byrd and Bennett, like a lot of contactees and experiencers of the 1950s, are warned about the dangers of nuclear proliferation. And this civilization told them, you humans have gone too far. We are now directly intervening to prevent you from destroying your planet, which is also our planet. Version number two, the monoplane lands on an airstrip inside a very advanced, futuristic-looking hangar. Byrd departs with advanced beings, gets into an elevator and goes down many, many levels where he gets a very similar briefing. Bennett stays in the cockpit or a reception area while Byrd goes underground. Byrd is then returned unharmed, shares the story with Bennett, and they're allowed to actually fly out of the hole. This also brings up what is seen in a lot of alien lore of Agartha. According to Byrd, this is actually the name the inner Earth inhabitants gave their realm. And so he allegedly records this in his diary, but pages of Byrd's diary are kept classified upon his return, and the public never actually gets to hear them. Now for that, I have my second clip. So just to cite my sources, this one comes from the fabulous and long-running Ancient Aliens show on the History Channel, a little bit about the Hollow Earth hypothesis. Let's check it out.
Ideas of an occupied Hollow Earth would be revisited nearly 2 centuries later, in 1947, when famous polar explorer Admiral Richard Byrd flew reconnaissance missions over the North Pole. Byrd allegedly reported in his private journal about a mysterious land beyond the North Pole, which he called the center of the great unknown.
Admiral Richard Byrd was able to fly to the North Pole and back and recorded flying over lush green areas where none should have been. And then 3 years later, he flew over the South Pole.
It's rumored that when Admiral Byrd's task force actually got to Antarctica, that one of the first things they discovered was an entrance into a hollow Earth civilization that was populated by very, very advanced beings.
Admiral Byrd made a lot of unusual statements, including talking about what he called a new kind of craft that could fly from pole to pole.
Is it possible that entrances to another world can be found at the Earth's poles? And if so, did Admiral Byrd actually pass through one of them? According to some ancient astronaut theorists, such gateways do exist. But rather than leading to inner Earth, they may be portals to another dimension. but whether an other Earth exists in another dimension, under our feet, or in a distant galaxy, what would its discovery mean for the future of humanity?
If we were to discover the other Earth, the place we have sought, the missing world, it would be profoundly humbling. So this would be quite a paradigm shift. History would change in a very major way.
Now, good clip from Ancient Aliens. If at the beginning you notice they said 1947, you're like, wait a minute, I thought it was 1926. I will address that 20-year discrepancy here in just a minute. So that'll lead us into what I call the attack. So this is the fourth of Byrd's 5th missions, Operation High Jump. Fred, my friend, take it away.
Oh, so I actually like this story. Byrd goes down there to check out Antarctica, and he takes, 4,700 men, 13 ships, 33 aircraft. So they're going to go down there, and they are looking for missing Nazis or what's going on down there, because I believe that they have a base down there that, that they're going to go down and they're going to check it out. And so the story goes, they go down and they encounter us. Would they call themselves the Agarthans down there as well? See, that's what I thought. And that's where I was getting confused, because I knew and I'm like, wait a second, I thought this, yeah,
right.
So, but they come in and again, 2 stories. Either he flies into it and willingly, or he flies into it and they come and talk to him and they give him warnings not to come back or whatever, blah blah blah. It starts out peaceful, didn't it?
Your recount is excellent, because it highlights some of the discrepancy of when did Byrd fly into the Earth. So how you said it is absolutely perfect. So as Fred said, this was a huge operation. Now, officially, they were simply mapping the Antarctic coastline, and they were going to establish a permanent U.S. research base called Little America 4. As the name implies, they had 3 other Little Americas there. Unofficially, this is the biggest post-World War II operation to date. This was an assault on Antarctica to eliminate these final pockets of Nazi resistance. And there are rumors, you'd mentioned Agartha, that a small strike force did actually reach the mainland and penetrated these Nazi-occupied caverns, but they suffered heavy casualties. So we have a lot of artist conceptions of what really happened on Operation High Jump. And officially, there are only 4 total casualties, and they were all because of equipment errors, 1 small plane crash. I think 1 sailor accidentally got run over by some heavy equipment. Only 4 casualties. But what's curious, despite 4,700 men in this armada of ships, they turned back after only 1 month, officially due to an early onset of the Antarctic winter. Unofficially, though, as they approached the continent, some disc-shaped UFOs or Haunaboos came up out of the ice. They engaged the U.S. fleet, and they immediately laid waste to them with what looked like particle beam technology. And so they fried the U.S. armada with what looked like lasers or beam weaponry. Quickly, Byrd realized that he was outmatched, and they called back the fleet and entered an uneasy truce with the Nazis. Now, if this seems like a little bit too much to swallow, allow me to add in Byrd's actual warning to the U.S. population. Now, you don't have to read all this. This is a cardinal sin in PowerPoint to put this much text up there. But I highlighted the key parts in yellow. When Byrd got back from High Jump, and keep in mind, he had already been to Antarctica 3 different times, so it's not like this was his first experience, his first rodeo. He warns the U.S. public of the possibility of an invasion of the country by hostile planes coming from the polar regions. He said the United States could be attacked by planes flying over one or both poles. And at the end, an exact Byrd quote, "I have to warn my compatriots, the time has ended when we were able to take refuge in our isolation and rely on the certainty that the distances, the oceans, the poles were a guarantee of safety." Because that right there conspiracy aside, was already a common belief in the United States. It's why we were caught so flat-footed at Pearl Harbor. People thought, you know what? Nobody's ever going to try to cross the Atlantic or the Pacific to challenge us. Now, post-World War II, after the Axis powers have been defeated, Byrd said there is still a real danger here. Somebody can get us no matter what. Now, Fred, I'm so glad that you shared the story exactly like you did, because here's the twist, and here's where things get confusing. This is a rabbit hole within a rabbit hole. Some people believe that Byrd's inclusion in the high jump story was just a cover to hide his actual destination, which was a return to the North Pole. So some people allege Byrd did find the hole in 1926, and then he was included in this operation while he was actually half a world away. So this is an actual excerpt from Byrd's journal. And I find it so fascinating. This is why I'm so into Apollo conspiracies, where you've got evidence to support a couple different viewpoints all at once. March 11th, 1947. I've just attended a staff meeting at the Pentagon. I have stated fully my discovery and the message from the master. All is duly recorded. The president has been advised. I am now detained for several hours. I am interviewed by top security forces and a medical team. It was an ordeal. I am placed under strict control via the national security provisions of this United States of America. I am ordered to remain silent in regard to all that I have learned on behalf of humanity. Incredible. I am reminded I am a military man and I must obey orders. So, the twist, I just call this version 3 Crystal City. It's very similar to the original North Pole story. So, it's up for everyone's own discretion. Are these two different accounts? Is it a conflation of accounts? Or is all of it just an urban legend? So, this time, Byrd departs for a similar briefing. Bennett remains in the cockpit or a reception area once again underground, and this time, Byrd supposedly sees a crystal city buried under the ice. So I believe I've got another... Oh, wait, no, that clip is coming up in just a little bit. So does anybody have anything else, any ideas, any thoughts on the Richard Byrd part of the story?
Just so I understand this correctly, you're saying that when he went to the North Pole, he flew into this hole. And you're saying this hole would lead through the entire planet and come out on the South Pole?
No, that's a great question. All the account says is it was really big and it led down inside of the earth. The account never actually says how deep it goes into the earth. They never actually say he went from the North Pole through the South Pole. Basically, and I just wanted to include all the possibilities, one of the side conspiracies of high jump was they invented the whole thing about aliens and Byrd being there to cover from what he was really doing at the time at the North Pole. It's a little bit of a stretch for me that they would create a conspiracy to cover a conspiracy, but I just wanted to put all the possibilities out there.
And what I like the hypothesis of the wormhole, that maybe it was like, not like a physical hole in the world that like he's just like going down into, but just so happens that like, if there's black holes in the middle of space, perhaps because of the magnetic core and the poles and the magic that happens at the top or the bottom of the earth, that perhaps there's like some kind of wormhole that leads to another dimension. So that to me is a lot more believable than the fact that the earth is straight up hollow and there's like another structure inside of it.
Brain's getting ready to break.
I'm so glad you said that. You set me up perfectly, because later, you guys are making this easy. When we examine the evidence, you're going to see a lot of people in modern times have gone to the North Pole and not reported anything out of the ordinary. So,
is there actually a landmass at the exact North Pole?
Nope.
No, that's what you're
it's
saying.
Water.
It's
nope.
just
And we're going to see a submarine actually travel directly under it. But to Julia's point,
you're not allowed to fly over it now, though, are you?
North Pole, yes. South Pole, no. They're different. Yes. Oh, these are all good. You guys are right.
Sidebar too. I also feel like this also reminds me of the Emerald City from The Wizard of Oz.
There's a lot of symbolism in The Wizard of Oz.
Which I feel is very archetypical.
I like that.
Yes.
I like that.
Yeah.
So, what evidence do we actually have of a hollow Earth? So, I can get through some of these pretty quickly. We have the ancients. We have different groups. This is the Macuchi from Brazil and Venezuela. They have oral traditions of entering caverns, traveling for 13 to 15 days to reach inner Earth. They claim giants lived there who were the protectors of our planets. Here in the Southwest United States, we have the Hopi Indian stories about the ant people. And the Hopi claim, and I love these Native American oral traditions, and I still feel in our modern times, not only is it being ignored, but we're basically pushing Native Americans out of any historical importance.
No doubt.
So according to the Hopi, there have been 2 destructions of the world. The first time the world was destroyed by a fire, which I wonder, could that have been an asteroid or comet impact? The second time they said it was destroyed by water. I sometimes wonder, could that have been the Great Flood? And they claim both times the ant people were friendly and they took as many of the Hopi down inside the earth as they could to protect them. What's interesting, if you look to the right of that petroglyph, that rock carving, does anybody notice the weird shape there? This spiral shape comes up in cultures all around the world. Some think the spiral was a depiction of time, like the Maya thought that time was cyclical, and if an event happened in one loop, it would repeat itself. But some people wonder, could advanced civilizations have basically showed our ancestors an outside view of the Milky Way, a spiral galaxy, which we still can't even see today, and then our ancestors dutifully recorded
the same why the Nautilus shape keeps showing up in nature?
Oh, yes.
Like,
and that's built on a Fibonacci sequence, it's called. So many of these shapes, they show up in crop circles all over, in crystalline structure. We're definitely missing a big part of the story. You're exactly right. So we have the great thinkers. We have Dr. Edmund Halley, who we mentioned. In exact Halley quote, "Beneath the crust of the earth, which is 500 feet thick, there is a hollow void." We have a number of them. Leonard Euler is one of the greatest mathematicians in history. And again, he believed the earth was hollow. A lot of these secret societies did. He claimed it was illuminated by a central sun. And that is also where you see black sun imagery with the Nazis, with Freemasonry. A lot of times the black sun doesn't refer to an eclipse. It refers to a central sun. And he believed there was a splendid subterranean civilization. Mathematically, he thought the earth had to be hollow. We even have author William Reed, the Phantom of the Poles. He studied these early expeditions. He thought Earth was hollow with holes at both ends of it. Now, in modern times, we now have satellites that can go over every part of the Earth. There's been some NASA imagery that has made people think a little bit. We have series of photographs from the NASA ESA satellites, and they always end up showing dark holes and no detail directly over the polar regions. If this sounds familiar, this was actually picked up by publisher Ray Palmer back in his Flying Saucers monthly magazine in 1970, and they showed it. Now, to give you both sides of the story, critics claimed these were simply NASA composites, because if you think about it, if you're looking down on the top of Earth, unless it's at one of the solstices, you're going to have some daytime and some darkness. But here, the whole thing is shown in daylight. So people are basically saying, well, this is a NASA composite. NASA just left out the polar region. But son of a gun, they still do it today, and it drives me absolutely crazy. This is from a NASA sea ice thickness website in 2022. And once again, the pole was left entirely off. And if you look close, it basically says latitude limit. Like, this is the limit of our satellites. But I got to tell you, even in my planetarium system, brand new system, when you zoom out from the Earth, son of a gun, there's that dark spot right over the North Pole.
What's the official explanation?
The official explanation is the satellites just didn't image up this far. That's the official explanation. Latitude limit.
Here, can't see.
Now that even takes me into now this could go so many ways, and we can go forward if we want. We're doing pretty good time-wise compared to our normal shows, but Legends of Hollow Caverns even leads us in to the Legends of the Dulce Wars. Have we talked about this on the show?
Yeah.
Okay. I feel that we have.
What's that guy's name?
This.
Oh, you don't remember this one? No. So this was Philip Schneider.
Yeah.
Fred, you want to give us, because you're so much better at doing a quick synopsis. Can you give us a quick synopsis of the Dulce Wars?
Notes,
so check it out. So Philip Schneider, he was a geologist, right? That's what he was.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they asked him to come check out this underground thing, and he's like, all right, yeah, sure, it's my job. I'm a geologist, and but they send military guys with him. And it's kind of funny that here you are just, mapping out a hollow space, and they're sending the military with you. So they go down in an elevator, whatnot, and they find out that there is a void, And when they go to check it out, they encounter underground people, reptilians. And it turns out into a battle. And basically the military guys were sent there to protect them. They had drilled into their base, their underground base. Imagine like if you were digging, you dig into an anthill. That's kind of like what happened. So these guys, they're not happy, the reptilians, and they open fire. they open fire.
Apparently.
And because, and so they're falling back. I mean, they're just pulverizing them with lasers. That's what it was, particle beams. And so they're falling back, and they get to the elevator, which takes a long time to get back up. And one of the guys, one of the military guys, throws Philip Schneider back in the elevator and tells him, get in. But not before Schneider gets blasted. He gets shot, and the guy throws him in the elevator, and the elevator closes, and Schneider gets up and out. And his proof is he's the only one who survives. Everybody else is annihilated, But they were just melting these dudes with these particle beams. So Schneider gives the whole thing is this happened, and I have the proof, to which they shows his melted hand, and he was shot and melted in the chest. Mm-hmm. And he died soon after, right?
Well, yeah, he basically, if you can, go onto YouTube.
Himself, right?
Well, go onto YouTube and watch some of the accounts, and he would go speak and say, I don't have much time left. I know. Yeah, and how
they were going to get him.
How they found his body was very strange. He was estranged from his wife at the time, but they still had an amicable relationship, and she was worried she hadn't heard from him for days. And so they broke into his apartment, and he was sitting in an odd position. He was sitting beside his bed. His feet were up on the bed, but he was sitting in the chair, and I believe he was totally naked, and he was just dead. And the coroner tried to rule it natural causes, but then the wife asked to actually see the body, and when she looked, he had a rubber hose that was wrapped around his neck. And she said, how in the world are you ruling this natural causes? The coroner's like, oh, I guess I didn't see that rubber hose right there. And so if you want to talk about people in the UFO field that were probably killed, Philip Schneider is right up there at the top of the list.
He knew that it was going to happen if he talked.
Yeah.
He talked.
And so that just leads us into DUMBs, deep underground military bases. There have been maps leaked out. And the scary thing, this map was leaked back in the early 80s. And so these things are now honeycombing the planet. And a lot of people think that militaries of the world are tapping into some of these existing systems that are actually
tunnel
there.
Systems, you're saying?
Yes. And I mean, I think that we maybe talked a little bit about deep underground military bases, but they're basically making these things with massive nuclear powered drills that are melting the rocks as they're going through.
Just a general question of physics. Yeah. So, I mean, when you go underground like that, like, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. Right? The human could only go so far down because we would melt ourselves, right? Or
isn't that
wrong?
Why they stopped doing that? Isn't that why they stopped digging that hole that they've been digging for like ever?
I assure our listening audience, we did not go over this ahead of time, even though these setups and segues are perfect. So, to give everybody both sides, let me give you some challenges to the Hollow Earth theory. Okay. For starters, Byrd was already a famous explorer. So prior to World War II, the Nazis actually invited Admiral Byrd to accompany them on their exploratory mission 1938-1939. So if you're really the Nazis and you're building a secret base down there, you're probably not going to be very likely to invite the most famous U.S. explorer at the time. Now, this is what Julie had mentioned earlier and Eric just did. Some other challenges. Number 2, drilling down into the earth has not gone very well. The deepest hole on Earth, this just got passed by an oil rig out in the Caribbean. But for many decades, this was the deepest. This was called the Kola Super Deep Borehole. And this was the most Soviet Union thing ever. They just wanted to see how deep down they could drill just for the heck of it. And they wanted to see if they could at least break through the continental crust. So they had estimated they would be able to go down at least 15 miles. It ended up not even close. They maxed out at 7.6 miles. The hole is capped. You can see it there, and you don't have to worry about falling into it. It's only 9 inches wide, and even 7.6 miles down, it reached temperatures of 365 degrees Fahrenheit. It was so hot, the drill bits started to melt. So they finally just stopped drilling. And so there you see a nice shot of how deep they actually got.
It's impossible. No, we couldn't make like a big old tunnel from like the North Pole to the South Pole.
No.
We could drive through.
Right.
How did we ever figure out like what all these layers were?
Anyway? That'll be like the very next slide.
Science.
Yeah.
I know. I mean, I'm sure there's an explanation.
That's why there's this term called theoretical in front of a lot of science
Yes. Oh, I forgot though. I got a great side conspiracy. Here's the side conspiracy. Get ready. The side conspiracy, now keep in mind, the Russians even today are a lot more spiritual than we are in this country. Faith, religion is still important to a lot of the Russian people. The urban legend is the Soviets did not stop drilling because the drill bits were melting. They stopped drilling because they actually put microphones down into the hole too, and they could hear moaning and wailing and screaming, and they were fearful that they were on the verge of drilling down into hell itself, which was very much a physical place on the earth. Now, let's get into the actual science behind it, because that is pretty terrifying. So, counterpoint on the hollow earth. Julie asked a great question. How do we know these layers are here? We've only ever gone 7.6 miles down. All of this, as Eric alluded to, is theoretical or indirect. What they do is, anytime an earthquake goes off around the earth, there's two different types of waves that come out of it, S waves and P waves. So pretend you and your friend are holding the jump rope out on the playground. If one of you starts moving the rope up and down, that's going to make S waves. Instead, if you pull it really tight and start to push back and forth, that makes P waves. So long story short, little bit of geology, they measure how the waves, the different waves, deflect as they move through the interior. So all of our knowledge about the mantle, the outer core, the inner core is all indirect. So I threw a little bit of math up there. I just calculated this ballpark on my own. On the right, you've got the full diameter of the Earth, 7,917.5 miles. We have only tunneled down 7.6 miles. So humans have only gone, get this, 0.00962% into the earth. And so this idea that, the earth can't be hollow, there's no way, we've explored it. We haven't. We've just barely grazed the surface. Now, some other challenges. Earlier, Eric asked, so wait, is there no landmass under the North Pole? There's not. The U.S. Nautilus actually traveled beneath the ice of the North Pole in August 1958, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. And just to show you the stones that these sailors had on board, this was a near suicide mission. The ice gets so thick up there and it can grow so aggressively. The worry was they could actually get iced in and they could just have to stay under the water in place for months straight until the ice melted. But these men actually made it through, and this was a well-documented mission. They went right under the North Pole and nothing actually happened. So is there no hole at all? That's going to lead into, Julia, just refresh the viewers. What did you mention as your theoretical possibility earlier? What if there's not a physical hole at the North Pole? What could actually be there?
Like a wormhole. Or like a, like a
black hole.
Yes.
Like a portal to another dimension.
So we may have mentioned this one. I bet we probably did when we talked Bermuda Triangle, but I just wanted to bring it back up. This is the best documented evidence so far in modern history of a human traveling through a time slip or some type of wormhole. So
I'm glad we're talking about this again. This
is
is like one of my favorite topics that we've talked about.
So this was 1970. Pilot Bruce Gernon is flying right through the Bermuda Triangle with two passengers. The skies are blue and clear. It's a beautiful day. All of a sudden, a wall of clouds appears right in front of his Beechcraft Bonanza A36. It happens so suddenly, he says, he can't avoid them at all. And he's looking for a place to try to drive his airplane through because he can see lightning in the clouds. And he said there was a gap and he could see blue sky beyond it. And then he said there was a counterclockwise vortex inside of it. And you might think, well, that's nuts. Why in the world are you flying into a counterclockwise vortex? Gernon said he had no choice. It happened so quickly. As he's flying through, he says he can see lightning in a circular pattern all around the airplane. He says the airplane's compass and all the instruments start to go haywire. And he says it even seems like he loses control of the airplane, like it's being automatically guided. So think back to Richard Byrd's account. He says, As they pass through to the other side, he and his passengers feel momentary weightlessness until he can regain controls of the plane. Now, at this point, you might think, well, yeah, that's a cool account, but anybody could make that up. Here's the evidence that we have. So ground control in Miami immediately picks him back up after his Beechcraft Bonanza is totally gone from their radar for minutes. But they're shocked because it's way, way closer than it should have been. So he finally lands, and I did the math behind it. He travels 250 miles in only 47 minutes, which is over 100 miles per hour faster than it could actually go.
I can do it.
So did Bird and his co-pilot hit some type of wormhole? Now, so far today, you can actually at least travel to the North Pole. So far, officially, nobody has actually disappeared from it. Eric mentioned this earlier. Flight over the South Pole is still restricted, but air travel over the North Pole, that's coming, I promise you, has been happening for decades. So, is there any actual conspiracy, or is modern science basically disprove the hollow earth? Just like people say today, hey, nobody's disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle for quite some time. Why is that? So, let's head south one final time with our return to Antarctica. Are there secrets hidden here in plain sight? For starters, the continent itself is very much an enigma. It might surprise you to learn Antarctica was not even officially discovered until the 1820s. They didn't even know the landmass, and I've seen different dates, anywhere from the 50s through the 80s. That's when they started to nail down the actual landmass separate from the ice. They did seismic soundings. Yet, curiously, in the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, absolute low point in human ingenuity, multiple maps surface showing a detailed view of Antarctica. This one is from Turkish Army General Piri Reis, who claimed to make this map off of 12 more ancient maps he had seen. Now, probably if you notice, the map is turned sideways. You can recognize the bump of Africa at the top, bump of South America at the bottom. If you all look far right, that is supposedly showing you Antarctic coastline. Now, skeptics have attacked this and said, no. That is more of South America. It's just getting distorted at the poles, just like our maps do today. But it's much tougher to explain away this map from Dutch mapmaker Orontes Phineas. Here he is not only showing you all of Antarctica, it's only 2 degrees off of where Antarctica is today. And the crazy part, notice, no ice. He is showing you mountain ranges and river basins, which we've been told have been buried under miles of ice for thousands of years. We even have a map from another French mapmaker, Philippe Boucher, who actually shows Antarctica minus ice and shows it as 2 different continents with a large sea going through the middle of it. So to try to add a little bit more oomph to this, in 1958, a well-known geologist named Charles Hapgood writes a book called Earth's Shifting Crust. And he actually alleged, he didn't say plate tectonics wasn't happening, that slow puzzle piece movement, but he said in a very short period of time, the entire crust is rigid and it can slide on the underneath layer called the asthenosphere, which works like a silly putty. Now, you might not know Charles Hapgood, but I'm sure you know this man, Albert Einstein. Hapgood and Einstein...
Bernie Sanders.
But a lot more successful and intelligent. So it actually corresponded back and forth. And Einstein so believed in this theory, he actually wrote the foreword to Hapgood's book. So this could explain why the ancients knew about Antarctica. It wasn't always down south buried under ice. It was actually much closer to us very, very recently. So just to jump through just a couple more things, our magnetic pole is actually shifting rapidly, and we're not totally sure why.
Didn't they flip spots like the...
I hope they have.
Well, you know what? I was going to fast forward, but maybe I shouldn't have. You're exactly right, Julia. We have great evidence. I learned about this way back in college geology in the early 2000s. every couple thousand years, the magnetic field flips and nobody knows why. North becomes south, south becomes north, and we're overdue for one today.
Dogs sleeping with cats, all kinds of things.
So when you see
Mass
this pole
hysteria.
drifting, some people think the reason it's happening is there is an inner sphere rotating independent of the outer sphere. Another man hit on this idea. Chan Thomas writes a book, The Adam and Eve Story, The History of Cataclysms. And the CIA actually stepped in and classified the work. And so just to wrap up,
what?
they actually, this surprises people, our government can step in. Freedom of speech does not matter. They can step in and say, what you are writing, the movie that you are making, is a threat to national security. You do not have the right to do that. And so every year there are a couple hundred things that are kept from the public due to national security concerns. So the book is out now. It's been re-released, but supposedly all the most scandalous parts have been taken out. So you can't talk Antarctica without at least mentioning the Great Flood of Noah. Being a Catholic my entire life, for many decades, I thought this was... No, let's go back to it. It's your show.
Well, no, okay. They can arbitrarily stop the publishing of a movie?
Yes.
Or written a book?
Yes.
I mean, because it's a threat to national security?
Yes.
Can they do that to like in another country? Like this guy, was he in China? Chan?
No, he was American.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So they can only do that in America.
Wait.
Right?
Our government
Okay,
does
that's
it.
what I
Not
mean,
all
like-
governments do it. Yeah.
Well, okay, take on Mike Moore's book, Capitalism, a Love Story. Couldn't there be a bent there to say, well, if you undermine capitalism, that's going to cause distress, and that's an anti-government movie. What's Al Gore making an inconvenient truth? Why is that not listed as a... I mean, think about it.
Well, a lot of people think now that Al Gore is covering for the globalists, and that was meant to be put out. I guess the great example that I could give you is
it's crazy. Like
look how many
so subjective.
Look how many scientists have died who have made water-powered cars. Look how many scientists who have died who have been very close to cold fusion. Look how many naturalistic healers have died who have presented cures for cancer, permanent cures that don't involve radiation or chemotherapy. So just having something basically pulled back and they tell you, hey, this can't be published, like those people are getting off pretty easy. Like people who get too close to some of these areas, the stakes are much, much higher. So, I mean, I guess this ties into, I mean, your skepticism is totally warranted. I think this sort of ties into the whole breakaway civilization notion. And this is basically a belief that we already have anti-gravity. We already have spaceships that can travel to the stars. We have colonies on the moon, Mars. We've had cures for cancer, but it is only being kept for a selective few, and it's no longer shared openly with the public. But this part, no conspiracy about it, and definitely read up on it. It's fascinating. They can classify things, and they will not get out to the public, which is insane. So I guess, could Antarctica tie it all into the Great Flood of Noah? What really got me thinking is years ago I was watching Ancient Aliens, and they shared that 1,300 cultures have Great Flood stories of their own. 1,300. 2 or 3, okay, maybe they just came up with the idea, but 1,300. So
Isn't that like the virgin birth? Isn't there just as many cultures that have a virgin birth story too?
there are a lot of parallel Jesus stories. And so some people ask, is that Jesus story the only one, or is it a conflation of multiple savior type? Yeah, there's a lot of that. So I've got 2 clips, but I'm only going to show this one. One last time, let's go back to the History Channel. Ancient Aliens, let's talk Great Flood and Hollow Earth together. Let's check it out.
The Bible's book of Genesis. In chapter 6, verse 9, begins the story of Noah and the flood, in which God sends a great deluge to rid the earth of sinners and start anew. Different versions of this same story exist in nearly every ancient tradition around the world.
Going back 5,000 years, we have sacred texts that tell us there was an antediluvian civilization. There was a great flood and that there were survivors. The Mesopotamians speak of this in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Egyptians speak of this in the Edfu creation text. Plato learned from the Egyptians that there was once a civilization called Atlantis that existed 9,000 years before his time.
Plato wrote about the lost continent of Atlantis in 2 of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, around 360 BC. Historians and researchers have long debated whether this pre-flood civilization was purely mythological or actually existed. Arguments have been made suggesting remnants of Plato's destroyed civilization could be found at the South Pole.
And this is why the Nazis were interested.
I think what happened in Antarctica was that approximately 13,000 years ago, that flourishing civilization that originally came from space and establishing its presence in Antarctica was flash frozen. We actually have ancient evidence of this in the form of Plato's dialogues, where he talks about the last days of Atlantis. That basically is informing us that Atlantis was an extraterrestrial colony that had established itself on Earth, and that after a pole shift, Atlantis was moved under the ice where the South Pole currently is.
As more and more pieces of the puzzle start to come together, might we soon be able to solve the mystery of the Antarctic continent? And if so, just what might we discover?
Modern whistleblowers still argue that there is more about Antarctica that is being covered up than we think. There are entire bases down there, entire civilizations, that the world's governments are working with aliens.
They know about the buried artifacts, they know about the ancient civilizations down there, and they know about the extraterrestrial civilizations that continue to operate in Antarctica at the very moment.
It's totally possible that Antarctica contains an extraterrestrial home base on Earth. It's a totally isolated part of the planet. It's completely uninhabited, or was until recently. It's ideal.
So just our final clip on from Ancient Aliens, tying those things together. So anybody have any thoughts before I just show a couple slides of what they found in Antarctica today? And then I think we'll be done.
The possibility of underground civilizations in Antarctica, if you think about it, if you have a cave system here anywhere, even, you know, if it goes down a mile deep, be it Laurel Caverns or be it, you know, was it Mammoth Cave? What's the average temperature of those places?
55 degrees,
yeah, 55,
I think.
57 degrees.
Yeah.
So you could have a sustainable climate for life.
So it's the idea that, like,
without sunlight,
underneath
though,
of all this, like, ice and everything, because the core temperature would, like, raise, like, the temperature. Is that what you're saying? Like that?
It's a constant that cave systems have. I mean,
can we live without sunlight though?
But what if you're under there, you've got melted groundwater is going to melt. It's going to go through. The sun's still going to penetrate through the ice.
Plus, too, I mean, think about nuclear-powered submarines. They can literally today, it's insane, they can stay underwater for years straight and not have to surface because of their nuclear generators. So in our nuclear age today, you could basically take small generators down that would fit in a briefcase, and you could power an entire colony or city down there for years straight. So power source is really not an issue at this point.
So that you're saying we can make our own oxygen down there?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Submarines have to do it when they're down low. And there's also, Fred didn't mention it yet, but there's we're going to see in Antarctica today, there are big geothermically heated areas down there that are quite warm.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was asking about.
Yeah, they're not sure why they're there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just a little bit from Antarctica today, you'll find pictures where recent ice melt has exposed what certainly look like pyramids or mountains that look a heck of a lot like pyramids. And some people believe these are actually the remnants of a more advanced civilization there. We have multiple important people visiting Antarctica for some reason. There's a picture of former Secretary of State John Kerry visiting in 2016. Here, We talked about him with Phobos, second man on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, also visiting in 2016, and he had to be life flighted out because he had a heart attack there. Now, on the left, this is a debated Buzz Aldrin tweet. And part of the reason I love Buzz Aldrin, he will be so much more open and honest about things going on than many, many other astronauts. So allegedly, he tweeted this before his heart attack. Picture of this pyramid-shaped mountain says, "We are all in danger. It is evil itself." But a lot of people think this was basically a Photoshop tweet because the format of the tweet was not correct. But what is correct is Buzz Aldrin was also there, had to be airlifted out. Now, there are odd discoveries in Google Earth in Antarctica from regular people like us. A lot of times, Google then wipes them off the map. So check it out. Now, these ones, I all confirm myself on Google Earth. I would say of the three, the one on the left is most likely to be a Photoshop job, because I remember finding the one on the left and it wasn't actually in the imagery, but for a while regular people could post their own photographs onto Google Earth, and it was a photograph somebody else had added. So of the three, the one on the left, for those of you just listening, showing what looks like a flying saucer being unearthed under the ice, might be a Photoshop. The two on the right are genuine. Here are the coordinates, but now here's the frustrating part. It appears to show a massive cave entrance into Antarctica, very similar to what Bird described. If you go there today in Google Earth, Google just has the entire area in shadow and darkness, and you can't find the cave entrance at all. We also have satellite photographs that appear to show things crashing into the ice in Antarctica. And then if you look at this photograph, some people think, was that a UFO that crashed into the ice? On the right, is that a convoy of tanks going out to actually recover it? We actually have multiple photographs showing things landing from the sky and making big gouge marks across the ice. And then Eric had mentioned this a couple minutes ago. Nobody can fly over Antarctica. This is a restricted area even for the military. There are no-fly zones. There are under-ice anomalies. There are reports today of disc-shaped silver UFOs coming up out of the ice. This is a lot more than a scientific outpost. The best story, if you want a modern account, the journalist Linda Moulton Howe is usually considered one of the more credible researchers in the UFO field. And so she has a lot of insiders coming forward to her. And so a man named Brian, who was 59 a couple years ago at the time of the interview, said that he was actually part of Antarctic Development Squadron 6. And so he was part of a crew that flew through a no-fly zone above Antarctica to try to rescue a scientist. So they were basically radioed to come do a medevac for a scientist who was at a different base. The crew was given on a roundabout way to fly, and they looked at it and they thought, you know what, if we actually fly this way, we're never going to make it in time. This scientist is going to be dead. So they made the executive decision to defy orders and just fly straight line right through the middle of the continent. He said when they did, he saw a huge hole in the ice. He saw silver discs coming up out of it. And then on a separate mission, there was a team of 12 scientists that disappeared for 2 weeks. Nobody knew what happened to them. And then they were found and they radioed back. They said, hey, we're back. We're actually here. Brian's flight crew went to get him and said they wouldn't talk. Their faces looked scared and they looked like they had just been through something totally traumatizing. So there's a lot more going on in Antarctica today rather than just a scientific outpost. So I do have one final twist to this story, but does anybody else have anything on Antarctica before I've got my final slide? So final twist. Is there a chance other civilizations are trying to lead us away from the polar regions? Because even the Nazis with simple World War II technology were trying to do the same thing. This is insane. We may have talked about this with the Atlantis show, but it's definitely worth repeating. The Nazis, to try to keep the Allies away from their polar regions, developed two inventions, the magnetofunk and the Himmelkompass. So let me tell you a little bit about it. The Nazi bases, their remote bases, were so secretive, they only identified them by 3 numbers. That way, and this is in spying tradecraft, even if you learn the name of it, it doesn't give you any additional geographic information. So they actually had a base up near the North Pole that they called Point 103. So the magnetofunk was a very classified Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapon. It created, this is insane, an artificial magnetic field around the base, which would gradually deflect the Allied compasses away from it. So the pilots, following their compass bearings, would assume they were flying in a straight line. But because the needles would gradually move, they would end up flying right around point 103 without seeing it. So if the Nazis are messing with the magnetic field, then how did they actually get to point 103? For that, they invented the Himmel compass. And a couple years on Ancient Aliens, they had an episode where one man in Germany believes that his grandfather was actually part of it, and he had one of them. This was actually a compass that would only navigate on the position of the sun rather than the Earth's magnetic field. So I just kind of threw that in there as an anecdote. So even since World War II, the Nazis had figured out, hey, we can manipulate the magnetic field to keep these places secret. Who's to say that a civilization, or maybe the original inner Earth civilization here, wouldn't do the same thing on a much higher level? So to end, part of the reason that I love the Hollow Earth idea, and I thought this presentation was so fun to make, is there's so many possibilities. Could there be a more advanced or even ancient civilization directing us away from the poles? Is there an inner Earth, or at the very least, as we talked about, some type of interdimensional window that can access these remote areas? Are governments of the world trying to extract this technology? Is that why the United States has been so interested in Antarctica? Or is it all just urban legend? And so I got to tell you guys, I am always honored to be here, and I'm always impressed. That was a 94-slide presentation. And every time I come in, I was like, oh my gosh, we're never going to get through this. They're going to hate me. That was great. We got that done in like 2 hours. That was awesome.
That was really good. I liked it.
This was a great one.
Thank you.
I agree.
Thank you, James.
No problem.
My
Thank you for
mind's
having me
even
back.
been more confused than it was when I came in here.
Now I just feel like every time we talk about this, I'm like, there's just like little aliens like hidden in every pocket of
Oh my gosh,
the
absolutely.
world, the dimensions.
Well,
that
there's
we're like.
no reason, in my opinion. I mean, there's no reason why, unless there's something really subversive, that the government would prohibit travel directly over the South Pole. And if they're doing that,
right,
they're obviously hiding something. They don't want something revealed. Just logic
Is this
would tell you.
magnetic thing still a thing? Like, is that part of it? Is it still scrambling?
Magneto-funk.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good name
is
for a
that
band,
still
Fred.
active or like?
No, it's not. The Allies discovered it post-World War II, but what's fascinating to me, the Nazis were coming out with that in the late 1930s. So a lot of what the Nazis did through Operation Paperclip, we brought as much of that technology back here as we could. So if they were able to do that then, what could we do with the magnetic field now? And then what could a civilization maybe thousands of years ahead of us, what could they do?
Wow.
So, you know what's interesting? I just saw a meme yesterday as I was just scrolling on Instagram, and it said, put on my tinfoil hat, ? Better than a blindfold. So it basically was like, okay, yeah, you're going to tell me. Cool. Well, at least I'm watching around. And, holes in the poles, Hollow Earth. Again, it's one of those things where you initially hear it, you're like, come on, that's totally absurd. But then if you actually do some research, you read a number of different things, you're like, okay, maybe I don't totally buy it, but there's at least enough evidence here that I can see why people would be into this,
Yeah, 100%.
So for anybody out there who hears these things, just try to push away the initial impulse like, oh, that's crazy. That's just totally nuts. Like, take the time to research some of these things, because for some of them, there might be more to it than you think.
Or take the time to listen to James's research.
Right on. Thank you, guys and gals. James, once again, home run.
Yeah.
Thank you, my friend.
That was
I feel
number
like they're
11.
getting better.
It's number 11.
As you say.
To the funk.
Could you give a little bit of a teaser to the audience of what we might do
Be glad to.
next time?
We're going to make a slight right or left
Pivot.
turn to music conspiracies. And between Fred and James, this is going to be insane.
Fred and I were already talking beforehand, and we're going to roll with this one. It's going to be good.
Fun.
Yeah.
Such a fan. I'm going to be all into it.
All right. We'll see you next time.
All right.
As always,
Peace.
thank you. Salute.
Yeah.
Wow.